In 2018, to coincide with the Gloomspite Gitz Age of Sigmar release, Games Workshop produced these. These are Squig dice, and they are odd. Not only are they shaped like squigs squished into a cube, kinda like those square pigs from the movie Space Truckers, but they're made of rubber, so they roll and bounce quite a bit differently to a conventional D6. A lot of people I've shown them to have compared them to small cubes of meat. I can't say it's an unfair description. Their sides are arranged in the traditional method, with each set of opposing sides adding up to 7, but the number pips pick out detail on the sculpt, like the pads of the feet or the teeth. If you are brave enough to actually use them in a game, you may encounter a couple of issues. One is that the unconventional way of marking them means that a lot of people, in my experience, find them kinda hard to read, a problem exacerbated by the paint being on the raised areas, i.e. the parts most likely to get it rubbed off since rubber doesn't exactly hold paint well. The other one is that they can really bounce all over the place when you roll them, they're a little unpredictable. Which leads me to suspect that very few people would have used these in any long-term fashion. They're just less convenient than a standard dice set. They're a novelty more than anything else. I've mostly used mine to do important roles for my Grot Rebellion army because I just think it's kinda funny to put my fate into the hands of these chaotic little cubes. But one thing I've often wondered is, are these things as dice even remotely balanced? Like, they've gotta be really biased in one way or another because, I mean, just look at them. However, I knew the only way that I would ever find out if my Squig dice were actually balanced was to roll them several thousand times myself and track the results. Which would be a massive waste of time just to satiate my curiosity over a thing that doesn't really matter. So I rolled the Squig dice several thousand times. Okay, so to make it slightly less ridiculous, I didn't just roll one Squig dice over and over and over again. I rolled all 20 of them from my pack at once and noted down every result. I did this for a while. I wasn't sure exactly how many I wanted to roll initially, but I ended up calling it quits after I'd rolled 3,000 Squig dice. Which I suspect might make me the person who has rolled Squig dice the most in the whole world. The average score a perfectly balanced D6 should get is 3.5, with a percentage chance of it landing on any one side being 16.67%. So, if we add up all the scores I got and divide them by the amount of times I rolled them, we will get a mean average roll for the Squig dice. And that score was 3.4983. That is a lot closer to the target than I thought it would be. That means, from the sample size I have, these weird blobs of rubber are just 0.0027 away from what a perfectly balanced D6 should roll on average. That is honestly astonishing. I would be shocked if I rolled any standard set of dice 3,000 times and they were that close. But let's break down the amount of times those Squig dice landed on each side, because there's some stuff going on there. Strictly speaking, in 3,000 rolls, we want to be getting around 500 rolls for each face. Here's what I actually got. Some of these are pretty much what you'd expect, but it does kinda look like these dice do not like to roll 5s. Only 426 5s seems pretty notable. That's around 15% less than it should be. 1s are kinda low as well, though not as extreme. And then we've got about 10% more of both 3s and 4s coming up, and those faces are opposite each other, which feels notable. Like, these results don't show completely crooked dice, but they do suggest some fairly prominent biases. To put this in its extremes, when I rolled one of these, I had a 14.2% chance of rolling a 5, but an 18.67% chance of rolling a 3, and those numbers should be more or less the same. In fact, I spoke to our friend Matt about this, since I wanted someone to check my work, and he's much better at this sort of thing than me, and a day later he sent me this video. and it explains that using the data I'd given him, he'd worked out that there was a less than 0.1% chance of fair dice rolling as my squig dice did, so we can be pretty damn sure that these dice are not fair. This kind of thing is one of many reasons why I love that man. So yes, these dice do seem to have a bias. You're all shocked, I can tell. But they're biased in such a way that it makes their average score remarkably close to what it actually should be, which I find fascinating. Now, there are some methodological issues with how I've chosen to go about this process. For one, when you're dealing with something like this, the bigger the sample size the better. I could have rolled several thousand more times, but to be fair, my sample size wasn't exactly tiny. Plus, I probably should have rolled like 3,000 regular d6 as well to run as a control group. Plus, by rolling all 20 of these at once, I'm testing the set as a whole rather than individual dice, and there could have been a couple in here that were really unbalanced and were skewing my values. But when playing Warhammer, you do tend to use dice as complete sets rather than as individuals, so I thought that was a concession that was fine to make. Also, the fact that I was rolling them in a fairly grippy dice tray might have affected the rolls, especially considering that the material these are made of tends to bounce differently on different surfaces. And I am only using my squig dice, yours may roll differently. I couldn't exactly test multiple sets because have you seen how much people are selling them for these days? Oh, and as a side note, having now rolled these dice a lot, the paint rubbing issue I alluded to earlier is actually pretty bad, so if you want to keep your squig dice pristine, maybe just don't roll them, which feels like the most boring kind of advice you can give someone for goofy dice, but it is what it is. So, are squig dice balanced? Well, from the data that I got, it certainly does not seem so. Mine appear to favour 3s and 4s, with 5s being particularly unfavoured, meaning that there are biases that exist that could, technically, be used to my advantage over a long enough time frame if I used them for specific kinds of roles, and was good enough at Warhammer for that to even matter, which, it should be noted, I am not. Does that mean that you shouldn't use squig dice in a game if you happen to have a set? Well, I'll be honest with you, whenever I have used mine in a game, my opponent didn't seem to be operating under the idea that they were fair or balanced to begin with. They were just amused to see them bounce around funnily. But it is probably best to keep these silly meat cubes away from any game that either you or your opponent are taking particularly seriously. Which I assume you were doing anyway. However, the fact that the mean average for my set was so close to what it should be, despite the actual dice being pretty skewed, is a really helpful demonstration of how a statistic can be 100% true while still being misleading because it's not the complete story. That's a little life lesson for you there in this video about novelty dice. You're welcome. And I guess I'll wrap up by apologising to any mathematicians who've managed to get this far. I'm sure it was great fun to watch a video where a person who barely understands standard deviation tries to explain statistics to you.